Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Tim and Audrey, and to all of you as well for this opportunity. It's wonderful, isn't it, to be able to sing together outside and to enjoy this beautiful place. And it is an honour to speak on this subject tonight. Where is God in all the suffering? Probably because there won't be a single person in this place tonight who hasn't in some way experienced pain. Some of us may have experienced true agony and trauma. Others of us may be processing the pain that's going on nationally as we process the pandemic. Or perhaps we've experienced economic or personal loss and trauma. And I think it's true to say in our world that we're in a moment of grief. Life has been hard, and even as we're starting to recover, the New York Times describes our kind of collective state in the West as languishing. Perhaps not full-blown depression or disaster, but a constant feeling that all is not well. Now, the real sort of darkness in our world and our experience of pain and suffering as human beings isn't something that any of us ought to be prepared to kind of sweep under the carpet. The question of suffering is of critical importance today as to what it means to be human, what we're here for, what life is all about, and whether there is a purpose beyond just eating, drinking, being merry, being happy, a purpose that is about eternity, a purpose that is about something more. Now, when we talk about God and faith and Christianity, perhaps a lot of people in our lives, and maybe some people here tonight, really deep down see faith as a fantasy, as a sort of embracing of unreality, as something that might help us get through the pain of life, something a bit like a drug that might lift us out of our pain for a little while. Some people take cocaine, other people take religion. It's a drug that just kind of numbs the pain of life. So it may be a surprise to hear that that is not how the Bible speaks about faith. The Bible doesn't speak of a fantasy world. It describes reality as you and I know it, as you and I experience it. A world in which there is joy and love and laughter, but also a world in which terrible and sad and devastating things happen to ordinary people. The story is told of a little girl who was 6 years old, and she was doing a project on birth at school. And she went to her mother and she said, "Mummy, how did I come to be born?" And the woman wasn't ready to have that conversation with her daughter. So she was a bit embarrassed, and she just said, "Well, darling, you know those big fat birds called storks? Well, a stork brought you. It flew over our back garden and dropped you, and that's how you came to be." And the girl looked a bit worried. She said, "Well, Mummy, how did you come to be born?" And the woman didn't know how to stop digging, so she said, "Well, one day Granny went into her back garden and a stork brought me." And the girl said, "Well, what about Granny?" And the woman said, "Listen, this is just how it happens in our family." The girl went back to school the next day to write her project on births and said, "There hasn't been a natural birth in our family for 3 generations." We can perhaps avoid facing facts, and people might think religion is a bit like that. It's an avoidance. It's a drug to lift us out of pain that's just temporary, or it's an avoidance of reality. But I want to suggest to you tonight that the Christian faith doesn't do any of those things. The Christian faith looks our world squarely in the eyes, acknowledging the suffering that you and I experience, and promising not just an explanation for how this could be, but also how God can love us and actually rescue us in this suffering world. I was at the funeral of the child of some dear friends a little while ago, and the service began with the thought that this precious newborn baby boy had never known a day without love. The pain and the grief of those who loved him most was the cost of that love, but he was loved. and it struck me right here. I believe that love is the starting place for untangling questions of pain and suffering, and especially the question of where God might be in regard to our suffering. Love seems to be at the absolute core of why suffering feels like it does. Suffering feels so wrong to us because of our love for another person who's in distress. And we instinctively rage against injustice when we see it because we feel that people who are suffering deserve love and dignity. And when I suffer, the deepest question is, am I really loved? And if it's true that I'm loved by a God, how could this be happening to me? When we ask questions about suffering, we're making an assumption that people have inherent and sacred value by virtue of being human. I have value because I am human. But should we take that for granted? Should we take the idea of intrinsic value as human for granted? As we try and wrap our heads around this question of God and suffering, aren't there other ways other than the Christian faith of looking at this question that are not grounded in the existence of a loving God? We may look at this world and ask the question, well, isn't it all just karma? You may be aware that Eastern philosophy views human suffering through these dual lenses of karma and reincarnation. And so when something painful happens, karma tells me, oh, there's this moral law of cause and effect. It guides the circumstances of our lives. If I get a disease or if someone has an accident, the law of karma tells me I'm getting what I deserve. And the fact that the thing I've done that makes me deserve pain may not be immediately obvious to me is complicated by the idea of reincarnation. In this view, the universe recycles over multiple lifetimes. So it's believed we might be experiencing the effects of karma because of something done in a previous life. I had a neighbour in Oxford for a couple of years who believed very, very passionately in the idea of karma. She actually believed that she'd been a member of the French resistance in a previous life. She felt that her failure to pass on a particular message during that time was the cause of her back pain. Karma was running its course. Karma does not love. Suffering is inflicted by a faceless system of law, leaving us with what it determines we deserve. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that everything is just fate. The Islamic worldview is one kind of a fatalistic worldview. There are others, but Islam has a sort of monotheistic view of the world that says there's one God, but this God is absolutely and directly in control of every aspect of the universe. And so as a consequence, human beings don't have real capacity to make choices. There's only one will in the universe, and that's God's will. That's why that phrase, inshallah, God willing, is so important. A few years ago, a friend described to me his experience of helping to train a group of Iraqi soldiers for service in their own armed forces. And one of the exercises that they were required to do was a sort of survival exercise. There was a swimming pool, and the recruits had these huge heavy packs on, and they were going to be thrown into the swimming pool, and they needed to swim to the surface. And two recruits were selected to have a go at this first of all, and they stood on the side of the swimming pool. They were given a push in, both with their packs, and they dropped to the bottom of the pool like stones. One of them began to struggle and swim up. The other just fell and didn't move. So this friend of mine, this instructor, dived in, and he got to the bottom of the pool. He got the pack off the guy. He got him up. He sort of hit him on the back, got the water out of his lungs, and he shouted to him, "Why didn't you swim?" And the guy shrugged. He said, "It's all inshallah. If it was God's will I lived, then I would live. If it was God's will I died, then I would die. Clearly, since I lived, that was God's will." That's one possibility. Again, love doesn't really come into it. Everything is just fate. Another possibility is that everything is just meaningless. A different point of view is offered by what we might call naturalism. Naturalism is a system, a worldview derived from the belief that everything in life has a purely natural or physical explanation. And so in answer to the question, where is God in this suffering world? The answer would be nowhere, because God does not exist. Naturalism tells us that there is no spiritual or religious dimension to life. There is no God who created the natural world. Human beings are their own highest authority and are well able to determine their own destiny. And within this way of looking at the world, we look at the consequence of living in the physical world and we say, well, any experience of pain is essentially random. It's just part of a physical material life. And since the physical biochemical world is all that exists, any sense of connection that I might have to another person who's suffering, any love I might feel for another suffering person is viewed totally through physiological, biochemical terms. So the pain I experience when I experience loss of someone doesn't have any deeper metaphysical meaning. Suffering, like everything else, is just flesh torn. It's totally material. But does the human experience of suffering, is it adequately explained by these alternatives? Isn't a deeper question that we all need to answer this? If human life is not essentially sacred and God-given, if we are here merely as an accident of chance, biology, karma, or chemistry, does our outrage and our anguish when we experience suffering, does that really make sense? Why would a human life have intrinsic worth? And why would we have such deeply conscious and emotive responses to pain and suffering if we're just a cluster of cells here by chance? Does human life have value? Does it really matter if thousands die in a global pandemic without access to a ventilator? Can we hear about the deaths of young people in classrooms on the other side of the world, gunned down by an unstable classmate, and simply shrug our shoulders? When we watch a documentary about wildlife in Africa and observe a lioness catching a warthog, do we have a similar reaction to when we watch a documentary about a serial killer murdering a woman? Does human life have essential value? And do our reactions to the sufferings of human beings make sense of our answer to that question? I want to suggest that whether we believe in God or not, the fact, our intuition that human life is precious, that human suffering matters, it actually points us to a view of the world that tells us that we have been created in the image of God, that life is sacred. You see, a Christian perspective sets forth the view that God does exist, that God is a personal being, and that he is essentially loving, and that he's made us as human beings in his image with the capacity to reason, to choose, and to love. And it would follow, if that were true, that suffering hurts as human beings in a profound and shocking way, because we really do matter. We are divine image bearers. And so our lives and our well-being is at some level sacred. If this is true, it would mean, regardless of whether we believe in God, pain and suffering will hurt at more than a physical level. Our suffering would matter, it would be deeply profound. If God is real and God is loving, pain will be the cost of love, because real love simply isn't possible without freedom of choice. Compelled love is never love. You see, the Bible speaks about a good God creating a good world and specifically making us as creatures who bear his image and have the capacity to make decisions, to make choices. I grew up not very far from here in Birmingham, and is anyone here from Birmingham? Just yes, hooray. Love the second city of the UK. Well, when I was 15, which is the age my oldest children are, my twins are now, I became friends with a girl whose parents were trying to force her into a marriage with someone she hadn't met. She was 15 and she was terrified. And she had really good reason to be afraid, because in the previous few months, a relative of hers had been in the same position, her cousin. And this girl had tried to run. Now, the family had found where she was hiding out, and they'd waited for her. And when she crossed the street, my friend's cousin, they got the car and they knocked her down, and they put her in the back seat of the car, and she hadn't been seen again. She'd been taken out of the country and forcibly married. My friend Shabs was 15 years old, and she knew she didn't want that for her life. I remember the teenage angsty-filled conversations. She felt that being forced into a legal partnership with someone she didn't know was the antithesis of love. I remember her saying, I want to live a life where I can choose who I love. She believed that she was capable of giving and receiving love, and that could not be forced by someone else. Now, friends helped her to escape that situation and to get into a safe house. But what that story illustrates is that for true love to be possible, it must be freely offered and received. We actually all know that to be the case in our lives. And the Bible tells us that God, who is love, made a world within which love is possible. And that means a world in which there is freedom. And the truth is that as human beings, we've used that freedom, yes, to love, but also to harm. And that is why there is suffering in this world. The Bible actually describes the impact of the choices that human beings have made, not just on ourselves, other people in our sort of lives, but also on the very environment, on the very fabric of this earth. The Bible doesn't just speak of why suffering might be around and how it's possible for a God to be loving and for there to be suffering in this world because we've had this capacity to choose. There's a deeper answer to this question of where God might be in a suffering world. And that deeper answer is found in the person of Jesus Christ himself. Because the Christian faith is not about a God who is remote, pulling the strings fatalistically far off, but a God who actually entered his own creation, like an author entering his own story. And that happened in space and time and history. It's a profound and radical and literally potentially earth-shattering claim made about the person of Jesus. The claim is that Jesus enters human history to demonstrate God's love. And he does that by living a perfect life, living a life of amazing compassion, living a life that has made him become the most influential individual in human history. But ultimately, he demonstrates his love not only by living, but actually by dying for us. You see, at the cross, the claim is that Jesus suffers for this suffering world in this suffering world. He calls himself the light of the world, and he takes upon himself the darkness of the world. God's love is demonstrated by God suffering for us. And that is why the cross, which when you think about it, is just a symbol of execution. Hundreds of thousands of people were crucified by the Romans. But yet the cross has become this extraordinary symbol. You see it on church buildings, you see it on university buildings, you see it on necklaces. It is so significant because it is a demonstration of God, the creator of life, entering our world and showing us sacrificial love. Now, a cartoon has been found on the ruins of ancient Rome walls, and it's now in a museum. And it shows how people who first heard this message of God dying on a cross for us and how they responded to it. The picture, the cartoon, has a man's body hanging on a cross, but it's a grotesque image because the man's body has the head of a donkey. And underneath this image of a man's body with the head of a donkey on a cross is another image of a young man kneeling and worshipping this image. And the satirical inscription underneath says, "He worships his God." A crucified God might be familiar to you and I. We perhaps barely think about it. But it was unthinkable that the one who made everything, the one so pure, so full of love for this world, would be so defiled, betrayed, abandoned, would suffer a gruesome and shame-filled death. You see, the cross shows us the God of love who suffers with us and for us, not a remote transcendent being in the clouds, irrelevant from our lives, but a God who was prepared to enter our world. Not a world of fluffy bunnies and saccharine religiosity, a world of blood and sweat and tears, a world where he experienced unimaginable physical pain, betrayal, abuse, and spiritual anguish on our behalf. You see, the promise of the Christian faith is that at the cross, God draws near to us in our point of need, in our suffering, all our rubbish, the things that have been perpetrated against us and the way that we have harmed others and this world. The dirtiness, the pain, the brokenness, the mistakes, they go on to Christ. He draws near to us in our direst need, offering us forgiveness, offering us a new life. Now, where I live, I don't know what it's like here, but where I live, the rubbish is only collected once every 2 weeks. I find it quite traumatic because it increases the urgency of not forgetting to put the rubbish out. I wonder who in your household is responsible for putting the bins out. I find this panic if I've forgotten. I've got to get the bins to the curb. If I don't, the rubbish is going to fester for a month. And that's what our hearts can be like too. We've all got rubbish perpetrated against us, rubbish dumped on us, and rubbish that we're responsible for. The promise of the cross is that Jesus can carry away that rubbish, our sin, and all we have to do is ask him. We've got to bring the bins out. That's it though. Our suffering, that which we have done to others, can fester, it can spoil our relationships, it can spoil so much in this world. Jesus put it like this, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." We may suffer, devastating things may happen to us. We may be persecuted, we may stumble in this world. Jesus is not promising an easy life free of suffering, but he is promising his light and that he can carry away the darkness that festers in us. The Gospel of John says the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. I wonder if you're here tonight and you know there's darkness in this world. You know there's abuse. You know there's human trafficking. You know there's all sorts of trauma in this world. The light of Jesus shines, not in ethereal, bubbly clouds in some fantasy land, not just in church. The light shines in the darkness. And I've seen Jesus do this in my own life and in the lives of many others. I've seen teenagers rescued from gang violence and paedophile rings in London. I've met the leaders of the Taliban and given them Bibles, one of whom had been praying for years to receive a Bible. I've seen city slickers, partners in London banks, weeping at a kitchen table, knowing the total emptiness that all the money in the world offers. and realising I need the light of the world. Jesus, his face, his presence with us. What a promise in this suffering world. So, where is God in all the suffering? The possibility of love leaves open the possibility of suffering, but God does not leave us there in just explanation of how things could be like they are. He himself comes in Jesus. God demonstrates his love for us in Jesus, offering us the possibility of a loving relationship eternally with God, a relationship that we've been created for, that all our longings that we may try to satisfy with other things actually are drawing us towards. And I want to ask you tonight if you hear his voice now. Do you hear that voice of Jesus offering you forgiveness, offering to carry your rubbish away, offering a relationship with him that will last beyond the grave, meeting you in your suffering, not in a pretend world where everything's fine, here, tonight, in this world, in your circumstances. The promise of the Bible, and a promise that as it has been experienced by billions of people around the world, is that God, that true existing God, is only a prayer away from any of us. So I want to invite you tonight, if you hear his voice, would you like to invite him in? Would you like to invite him to carry the rubbish away? Would you like to invite him into your heart for that beginning of a relationship with him? Why don't we just close our eyes for a moment? And I'm going to lead us in a prayer. There's absolutely no pressure, and I'm not going to make anyone do anything embarrassing, just to say. All we're going to do right now is that I'm going to say a prayer which goes along the lines of sorry, thank you, and please. So the sorry is just acknowledging our part in suffering of this world and the rubbish that we've caused, not only in our own lives, but in others. And it's bringing that to Jesus. The thank you is saying thank you to him for coming into this world and dying on the cross. And the please is just asking him in. So if you would like to do that, I'm going to pray, and perhaps you would echo it in your heart. But again, as I say, absolutely no pressure. So God, in this barn tonight, we want to begin by acknowledging the rubbish and saying sorry for our part in it. I would like to say thank you to you for dying on the cross and for that offer of new life, of your light, and of forgiveness, of you carrying away my rubbish. And I would like to say, yes, please. Please, would you do that for me tonight? Please, would you come into my life? Please, would you give me that new start and that forgiveness that I desperately need? Amen.